Mr. Considine, thank you very much for joining us today. As I said, I've been looking forward to this conversation. It's really going to be coming up in the news pretty soon.
Good day to you, Corey, and to your listeners as well.
So maybe just to give a bit of background, I spoke a little at the introduction of the show, but for folks who perhaps aren't quite as old as ourselves, it was a huge issue, of course, throughout the 1990s with yourself and Sue Rodriguez, and Sven Robinson did some fantastic work on it. I don't often applaud NDP members of parliament, I have to admit, but in this case, it was I think he did a fantastic job. But things have changed. But the Sue Rodriguez case, if you could kind of put in a nutshell what happened there.
Certainly. Sue Rodriguez lived in Victoria. She had ALS, which paralyzes you essentially. It stops various organs functioning. You end up in a wheelchair, unable to speak, feed for yourself, etc. The length of time for which this disease lasts is typically 2 to 3 years before death, although there are some exceptions, such as Stephen Hawking. Sue came to me having worked with other broadcasters across the country, explaining her plight. She knew that she was facing ultimately the wheelchair. She knew that she'd find it very difficult to feed herself, have a dignity of quality of life, and wanted to have physician assistance to die in a manner which was not just letting her die from the disease itself, but gave her some control as to when she could die and her timing and saying goodbye to her family and her friends. We went to ultimately the Supreme Court of Canada, where we lost on a 5-4 split on the basis that the Supreme Court of Canada felt that the government of Canada should address the issue to allow medical assistance in dying as an option for those who are terminally ill with a physical illness, such as cancer.
Yes, and then I guess eventually Ms. Rodriguez managed to find a doctor who anonymously helped her end her life eventually, and things moved on. But it took until 2016 before it was really actually legalized, right?
Yes, that's right. So many broadcasters, I'm sure including yourself, across the country would periodically revisit the issue. The population of Canada on various polls were approximately 78 to 80% in favor of having this as an alternative means for people who are at the end stage of life, rather than enduring the ongoing indignities. So Sue, in a way, she lost the war in the sense of going to the Supreme Court of Canada, but she had opened the door, never been opened before in this country, and it was really the first legal test case in the world on the whole issue. And she, as you say, did have the success with a physician coming forward. At that time, it was illegal to help her with her death, and she was very pleased by that opportunity. Since that time, as you know, for those with physical disease, which meets the definition of the revised terms, I've heard from many people who've said from their families or from themselves when they're about to have the assistance of MAID, that they welcome this as an alternative. And it should only be regarded, of course, as an alternative. It should only be regarded as an opportunity for people to have an option. So options include refusing to have ongoing medical treatment. Options include refusing to be hooked up to machines or asking to be disconnected from machines. And the options are to let the disease take its course. And then in this particular case is actual MAID with the proper protocols in place to protect the patients.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a sensitive, difficult issue. A lot of us don't even, just like necessarily talk about it, but it's something we will all face end of life at one point or another, and we have loved ones. And there's no, I think, sanctity more important than that of our own bodies, particularly when choosing the end. But now, as you'd said, I mean, as well, in the case of Ms. Rodriguez and a lot of others, I mean, it was sort of established, okay, somebody with a terminal illness, that their standard of living was going to be greatly deprived. And the one part as well, those typically they were of sound mind. But now what I'm wondering is, where do we go when we're talking about adding it for mental illnesses? I mean, those are some very vulnerable people that you're sort of offering an option to. It kind of opens a whole new bag of worms.
Yeah, so you certainly asked some very interesting questions. So remember that this was for a person who was terminally ill. There was no real prospects of a recovery for them. It was they were going to die, and the question was the option in terms of approach to death. There are, however, two issues on the cognitive side or mental side which have arisen recently. First is that, as you correctly say, Corey, to have MAID, you have to be in your cognitive state of mind. You have to be able to consciously say, I understand the situation and I wish to have MAID, and tell that to the physician administering the MAID. For a big issue which has arisen over the last few years has been that what happens when people express that, but they also become demented or develop Alzheimer's and are no longer able to express that wish at the end. Can they give advance directives? So that's one issue, and we're still grappling with that as a society. The other big issue which has arisen and is coming up as of March 17th, 2023, in terms of implementation, is MAID for those with mental illness. They're not necessarily physically ill. They're not terminally ill from a physical perspective, but they're finding that life is intolerable due to a mental illness. In Parliament, this government of Canada has said that it is prepared as of March 17th, 2023, to permit persons with mental illness, providing they meet certain criteria, to have and seek and have MAID. But there are a lot of potential problems with that, in my view.
Well, yes, absolutely. I was looking at one recent story on this, a lady named Judy LeBlanc. She has a mental disorder as her primary condition. She has an 11-year-old son, I believe. But she's kind of gone back and forth. At times she feels it's the appropriate path for her, and at times she doesn't. And again, when she's suffering from mental illness, which can be debilitating, and certainly people with that are suffering. But are they in a position then to make such an irreversible choice?
Well, Corey, we need to also look at the big picture of healthcare in this country. Canada, at the present time, does not have adequate mental health resources in order to allow mental health MAID to go ahead, in my view, in most circumstances. And as you are aware, 80 psychiatrists approximately a week ago came out as a block and said, we're not ready for MAID for persons with mental illness because there's not the fundamental resources available to them so they can make an informed decision. In medicine, we always advocate, and I'm not a doctor, of course, but I work a lot with doctors and patients. We always advocate for informed decisions. We advocate for that in other professions as well. Here, patients who are mentally ill do not have access to mental health facilities in this country. I have worked with many, many people who can't get in to see a psychiatrist, often for upwards of a year. Psychologists, often upwards for 6 months, and they have to pay for it themselves. People who are in remote parts of this country have very great difficulty accessing mental health care. We don't have the resources available by way of facilities if somebody needs to be hospitalized for other than perhaps a few days sometimes. In addition, why is there mental health disorder in certain circumstances? A lot of it relates to a lack of adequate housing, food, happiness with life, and opportunities. And until we address some of those issues, again, it may be an easy way for persons to seek an out from the difficulties they experience, but we're not fixing the problems which are underlying the unhappiness that they have. So I think that only in the most extreme cases should this implementation take place in March, but otherwise I am very concerned that we will see people who can be cured from their depression with the right resources taking MAID.
Well, that's it. And with a physiological condition, I think where most people agreed when you're talking about the older polling was when it was pretty much agreed on that the condition was terminal. So there was no treatment available. But as you said, many mental health issues can be stabilized and treated with the proper resources and facilities. So to offer that out rather than examining being able to give that treatment is not I guess a morally acceptable option. And some of that discussion's happening as well, though it's a bit more anecdotal, but some people saying they can't get the health resources for their physiological condition as well, and it's left their life so intolerable that they want to go for MAID. Well, in that case, shouldn't we be examining how to get those resources to them in a more timely manner?
Well, certainly with mental health illness, I have seen so many people who've been very, very depressed, who've talked to me about wanting to die. And when they're directed to the right healthcare professionals with the right assistance, medication, counseling, etc., right changes in their life circumstances, they recover from the depression. But if we're not able to provide those options to people, then I'm very, very concerned about permitting them to go ahead with MAID. Hopefully the doorkeepers will be the MAID physicians who will also say, there are other potential options out there, and until those have been exhausted and government has given you the options to pursue, we're not prepared to provide MAID. That's what I hope will take place.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I wanted to get to asking. Back in the 90s when you were fighting this cause, was what we're looking at today what you were envisioning this evolving to eventually?
It's a good question. The Chief Justice Lemaire, who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada at the time that I was appearing before him and the court on Rodriguez, had raised that very question. He said, what about those with mental health? And my response to him in court was that we were not yet ready as a Canadian society to go there. We should take MAID with great care as we explore it. And therefore, I advocated for those with grievous physical illness leading to death, that they were terminally ill, should be able to have MAID. And he agreed with that, by the way, as did the subsequent Chief Justice, Bev McLaughlin. And ultimately, as you know, everybody agreed with it in the Carter case as a result of the experiences in the United States, certain states in the United States and in Europe. So I think that was fine. But to go with the mental health at this stage where we don't have the right resources can open some real concerns. The other concerns we see is that if we open it up too much, then we can see a repeat of what happened at Veterans Affairs. And you'll remember several weeks ago, there were some of our fine veterans who do suffer from depression, because I've worked with some of them. I know the terrible circumstances they have to confront sometimes. And to be told, well, you can just go get MAID, even though they're not terminally ill from a physical perspective, is unfortunate. It's a cop-out. We need to really think about this very, very carefully and provide the resources, just as those 80 psychiatrists have advocated.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up with the veterans, because that sounded almost like a case, even if perhaps well-meaning, but of coercion. And that's a whole other issue as well. I mean, the person's choice should be on their own. They should know the alternatives they have, but I don't think any medical professionals should be necessarily encouraging people to move in that direction in any circumstance. They should just let them know what the alternatives are.
Yeah, and I don't think that was a medical professional. I think it was a sort of a case officer in Veterans Affairs, from what I can gather. But it becomes such an easy cop-out to say, well, if you're depressed, just take MAID. That's not acceptable in our Canadian society. We have a very fine society. We're regarded as one of the best places in the world to live. And we therefore have a responsibility to those who are less fortunate, whether they be have mental health issues, which probably many, many people do in our society at one time or another, physical illness issues, and we need to provide those alternative resources so they can be properly explored.
Yeah, so just to wrap it up, sort of, and getting back to your area of specialty, though, one of the commenters had mentioned, do you foresee legal challenges potentially coming from this? I could see this perhaps from family members who have a family member who's choosing MAID, but is doing so with a mental health disorder. This probably isn't cut and dry, but as far as the law is concerned.
No, I can see in certain circumstances in which a family learns that one of their beloved ones intends to take MAID with a mental health issue, and that those mental health issues alternatives have not been explored properly or made available to the person, that an application could be made to for an injunction in a courtroom to say, look, this doesn't meet the criteria and this should stop. So it'll be very interesting to follow that through.
Great. Well, we've got a lot to examine and think about as we come into this, I guess, this issue in these legislative years. I really appreciate the work that you did on this in the 1990s, and that you're still maintaining. It's not an ideologically fixated view on this by any means. I mean, it's a challenging, nuanced issue that's not cut and dry, and we still need to keep talking about it. So I thank you very much for coming on to talk to us today about it.
My pleasure, Corey, and thank you for your interest in the subject.
Great, come on, let's go. It's busy keeping the house going and getting everyone where they need to be. Awesome. But when it comes to my wellness, I stay connected to my community, and it feels pretty good. And if I need support, I call 211.
Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada, and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. You become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny. You can become a Western Standard member for just $10 a month or $99 a year for unlimited access.